I'm 73 years old now, and for 33 years, I've carried a secret that has slowly eaten away at everything I thought I understood about this world. I know what you're thinking. Another old man with another Bigfoot story. Another retired forest ranger who spent too many nights alone in the woods and let his imagination run wild. I've heard it all before. I've told myself those same things for 3 decades, trying to convince myself that what happened in the Olympic National Forest in the fall of 1991 was just a hallucination, a trick of the mind, a moment of madness brought on by isolation and exhaustion. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And more importantly, I know what spoke to me. Not grunts, not howls, not the primitive sounds you'd expect from a creature that supposedly doesn't exist. Perfect English, clear as a radio broadcast, with an accent I still can't place to this day. My name is Theodore Marsh. Most people who knew me back then called me Ted. I spent 41 years working for the United States Forest Service, the last 27 of those stationed in the Olympic Peninsula, one of the most remote and pristine wilderness areas left in the continental United States. I've walked trails that haven't seen human footprints in decades. I've documented species of fungi that scientists didn't know existed. I've pulled hikers out of ravines, recovered bodies that the mountain never wanted to give back, and spent more nights sleeping under ancient cedars than I ever spent in my own bed. I thought I knew those woods. I thought I understood every sound, every shadow, every creature that called that rainforest home. I was wrong. If you're still with me, if something in my voice tells you this isn't just another campfire tale, then I need you to subscribe to this channel right now, because what I'm about to tell you isn't just my story. It's a warning, and I need to know that someone out there is listening before it's too late. The Olympic National Forest covers almost 630,000 acres of some of the most impenetrable terrain in North America. We're talking about valleys so deep that sunlight only touches the forest floor for a few hours each day. We're talking about rainfall that exceeds 12 feet per year in some areas, creating a temperate rainforest that feels more like another planet than anywhere in the United States. The trees there, the Sitta spruce and western red cedar, some of them have been standing for over 1,000 years. They've watched civilizations rise and fall. They've kept secrets that predate human memory. In September of 1991, I was 40 years old, at the peak of my career, and more comfortable in those woods than I'd ever been anywhere else in my life. My marriage had ended 3 years earlier, not because of anything dramatic, but because Sarah finally understood that I'd already married the forest long before I'd married her. I had a small cabin about 15 miles from the nearest paved road, a shortwave radio that worked when it wanted to, and a routine that had kept me sane for nearly 2 decades. Every morning, I'd wake before dawn, brew coffee over a propane stove, and plan my patrol route for the day. Most of my work involved trail maintenance, wildlife surveys, and the occasional search and rescue operation. It was solitary work, but I'd grown to love the solitude. The forest had a way of filling the silence with its own kind of conversation, if you knew how to listen. That September was unusually warm. The summer had been dry, and the fire risk was elevated, which meant I was spending more time than usual in the backcountry, monitoring conditions and checking on remote areas that most people never knew existed. It was during one of these extended patrols that I first noticed something was wrong. The animals had gone quiet. Now, I need you to understand what that means in a rainforest like the Olympic. These woods are never silent. There's always something, the call of a varied thrush, the chatter of Douglas squirrels, the distant drumming of a pileated woodpecker. The forest breathes with sound. It's a living thing, and like all living things, it has a voice. But on the afternoon of September 14th, 1991, that voice went silent. I was about 8 miles into a 12-mile loop, following a game trail that ran along the upper Quinault River drainage. The weather had been clear all day, not a cloud in the sky, which was rare enough to feel almost wrong. I'd stopped to refill my water bottle from a small tributary when I realized I couldn't hear anything except the sound of the water. No birds, no insects, not even the wind in the canopy. I stood there for what felt like minutes, my hand frozen on the cap of my water bottle, every nerve in my body suddenly alert in a way I hadn't felt since my early days on the job. There's a term we used in the service for moments like that. We called it predator silence. It's what happens when something moves through the forest that every other creature recognizes as a threat. Deer do it, elk do it. Even the birds know when to hold their breath. But in all my years in those woods, I'd never experienced a silence that complete. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just a predator. It was something the forest itself was afraid of. I finished filling my water bottle slowly, deliberately, trying not to make any sudden movements. My eyes scanned the tree line, looking for any sign of movement, any shadow that didn't belong. The rational part of my mind was already constructing explanations. A cougar, maybe. We had a healthy population in the area, and they were known to create that kind of reaction in prey animals. Or perhaps a black bear, though they were usually more active at dawn and dusk. But something deeper, something older than rational thought, was telling me that this was different. I shouldered my pack and continued along the trail, moving more quietly now, placing each footstep with deliberate care. The silence followed me. It moved when I moved and stopped when I stopped. Whatever was out there, it was tracking me. It took me another 2 hours to reach my planned campsite, a small clearing near an old-growth grove that I'd used dozens of times before. By then, the sun was getting low, painting the canopy in shades of gold and amber that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. But I couldn't appreciate it. I couldn't think about anything except setting up my camp, building a fire, and putting something bright and warm between myself and whatever was watching from the shadows. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat with my back against an ancient cedar, my fire burning higher than regulations technically allowed, and I listened to the silence press in around me like a physical weight. And sometime around 2 a.m, I heard it. A voice, clear and unmistakable, coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond my firelight. "You shouldn't be here, Theodore." My name, spoken in perfect English, by something that wasn't human. To understand what happened next, you need to understand who I was before that night. You need to understand how a man ends up alone in the deepest wilderness in the lower 48 states, comfortable enough with isolation that he stops questioning whether the shadows are watching back. I grew up in Tacoma, about as far from the wilderness as you can get, while still being in Washington state. My father worked at the port, loading and unloading cargo ships that came in from Asia. My mother worked at a laundromat until her back gave out, and then she worked at home, taking in sewing and alterations for the neighbors. We weren't poor exactly, but we weren't anything else either. We were the kind of family that existed in the margins of the American dream, close enough to see it, but never quite able to touch it. The forest was my escape. Every summer, my Uncle Ray would take me camping in the Cascades, teaching me how to read the land, how to move through the woods without leaving a trace. how to listen to what the animals were telling you if you were patient enough to hear. Uncle Ray had been a logger in his younger days, back before the spotted owl controversy shut down half the industry, and he knew those mountains like he knew his own hands. He was also the first person who ever told me about the wild men. That's what the old-timers called them. Not Bigfoot, not Sasquatch, not any of the names that the television shows and tabloids would later make famous. Just the wild men. They said it matter-of-factly, the same way they'd talk about bears or cougars, or any other creature that shared the forest with them. Uncle Ray told me that his grandfather, who'd come over from Norway in the 1880s and worked the logging camps in the Olympic Peninsula, had seen one once. A figure standing at the edge of a clear-cut, watching the men work. So tall that at first they'd thought it was a snag, a dead tree still standing. It watched them for nearly an hour before walking away into the uncut timber, moving on two legs with a stride that covered more ground than any human could match. I asked Uncle Ray if he believed the story. He just shrugged and said that his grandfather wasn't a man who made things up. I joined the Forest Service right out of high school in 1969. Vietnam was happening, and a lot of my friends were getting drafted, but I had flat feet and a heart murmur that the army doctors didn't like the sound of. The Forest Service was happy to have me. They were always looking for young men who didn't mind hard work and harder conditions, and I fit the bill perfectly. My first posting was in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, just north of the Columbia River Gorge. It was beautiful country, but it was also heavily trafficked, full of weekend hikers and summer campers who needed constant supervision. I did my job well enough, but I always felt like I was playing ranger rather than being one. The real wilderness, the places where the maps still had blank spots and the trails were made by animals rather than humans. That was what I wanted. I got my wish in 1973 when I was transferred to the Olympic National Forest. The Olympic Peninsula is unlike anywhere else in the United States. It's a world unto itself, cut off from the rest of Washington by the Puget Sound to the east and the Pacific Ocean to the west. The mountains at its center catch the moisture coming off the ocean and create a climate that exists nowhere else on the continent. On the western slopes, you have the Hoan-Quinault rainforests, temperate jungles where the annual rainfall is measured in feet rather than inches. On the eastern slopes, you have dry pine forests that feel more like Montana than the Pacific Northwest. And in between, you have everything from alpine meadows to glacier-carved valleys to old-growth forests that have never heard the sound of a chainsaw. It was in those old-growth forests that I found my home. My supervisor at the time was a man named Harold Whitcomb, a 30-year veteran who'd seen everything the forest had to offer and kept his opinions about most of it to himself. Harold taught me the unwritten rules of the backcountry, the things that never made it into the training manuals. He taught me which areas to avoid during certain times of year, not because of any official designation, but because things got strange there. He taught me to pay attention to the native elders from the Quinault and Marca nations, who knew the forest in ways that no amount of scientific training could replicate. And he taught me that there were some things in those woods that didn't have names in any language, and that the wisest course of action was usually to leave them alone. I thought he was being metaphorical, or maybe just superstitious, in the way that people who spend too much time alone sometimes become. I was young, and I believed in the power of rational explanation to solve any mystery. By 1991, I'd been in the Olympic for 18 years. I'd seen things that I couldn't explain, brief glimpses of movement that didn't match any animal I knew, footprints that appeared overnight and vanished by morning, sounds in the darkness that seemed almost like language. But I'd always found ways to rationalize them away. The mind plays tricks when you're tired. The forest creates optical illusions with light and shadow. There are dozens of explanations for any strange experience, and I clung to them like a drowning man clings to driftwood. The months leading up to that September had been unusual though, more unusual than I wanted to admit. It started in June, with the disappearance of a graduate student from the University of Washington. Her name was Michelle Hernandez, and she'd been conducting research on my carizal networks in the old growth sections of the Quinault drainage. She was experienced in the backcountry, well equipped, and she'd filed a detailed itinerary with the ranger station before heading out on what should have been a routine 3-day survey. She never came back. We searched for 2 weeks. I personally covered more than 100 miles of trail, checking every drainage, every ridge, every place where a person might have gotten lost or injured. We found her camp, still set up and undisturbed. We found her food cache, still hanging from a bare wire, exactly where it should have been. We found her notebook, full of detailed observations about fungal growth patterns and soil composition. But we never found Michelle. The official report called it a probable droning. The rivers were running high that summer, and it was the most logical explanation. But I'd been in those woods long enough to know that drowning victims usually turn up eventually. The water gives them back, one way or another. Michelle's body never appeared, and in the weeks that followed I started noticing the signs. Footprints, appearing on trails that I'd walked the day before. Not boot prints, not bear prints. Something else. Something that pressed deep into the soft forest floor with a weight I couldn't calculate. The stride length was enormous, 7 feet or more between steps. Whatever made them was moving through the forest with a purpose I couldn't understand. I started carrying a camera, started documenting what I found, started staying out longer, pushing deeper into areas I'd always avoided, driven by a curiosity that felt almost like compulsion. I didn't know it then, but I was being led. "You shouldn't be here, Theodore." The words hung in the darkness like smoke, clear, precise, spoken with an intonation that sounded almost formal, like a professor addressing a student who'd wandered into the wrong classroom. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Every muscle in my body locked into place, the fire crackling between me and whatever had just spoken my name. "I know you can hear me." The voice again, closer now, though I couldn't see any movement in the shadows beyond the firelight. "And I know you've been looking for me. For us." My hand moved slowly toward the holster on my hip. I carried a Smith & Wesson Model 29 when I was in the backcountry. A .44 Magnum that could stop a charging bear if you put the shot in the right place. I'd never had to fire it at anything larger than a rattlesnake, but the weight of it in my hand was the only thing keeping me from coming apart completely. "That won't help you." The voice sounded almost amused. "But I understand the instinct. Your kind has always reached for weapons when frightened. It's one of your more predictable traits. My kind." The phrase echoed in my mind, and something in it broke through the paralysis that had gripped me. Fear transformed into something else, a desperate, irrational need to understand. "Who are you?" My voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "What are you?" Silence. The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. And then, at the very edge of the firelight, I saw it move. I've tried to describe what I saw that night to perhaps a dozen people over the years. None of them believed me. None of them could. because what stepped into the edge of my firelight that September night didn't belong in any world they understood. It was tall. That's the first thing my mind processed, because that was the easiest thing to accept. Tall, well over 8 feet, with shoulders so broad that it seemed to fill the gap between two ancient cedars like a door filling a frame. Its body was covered in hair, dark brown or black. It was hard to tell in the flickering light, but the hair wasn't uniform. It was shorter on the face, longer on the arms and chest, arranged in patterns that suggested grooming, deliberate maintenance. But it was the face that I couldn't look away from. Not animal, not human. Something in between, or perhaps something else entirely. The brow was heavy, protruding over eyes that caught the firelight and reflected it back with an amber glow. The nose was broad and flat, almost ape-like, but the jaw was different, more refined, more human. And when it spoke, I could see that its mouth moved in ways that no ape's mouth could move, forming words with a precision that spoke of long practice. "I am what your people have always called us," it said, "though you've used many names over the centuries. Sasquatch, Samerquas, Omar, Bigfoot." It pronounced the last word with something like distaste. None of them are correct, but none of them are entirely wrong either. I realized my hand was shaking. The revolver suddenly felt absurd, a child's toy in the face of something that had existed. I understood instinctively, for far longer than my species had words to describe it. "The woman," I heard myself say. "Michelle Hernandez. Did you?" Is she ... single quotes. The creature's expression shifted. It was subtle, a movement of muscles beneath the hair that covered its face. But I read it as clearly as I would have read a human expression. Sadness. Genuine, unmistakable sadness. "It's found something she shouldn't have found," it said. "Not us. Something else. Something that uses these forests for purposes your government doesn't want you to know about. We tried to warn her. We always try to warn them. But your kind doesn't listen." It paused, and when it spoke again, its voice was softer. "She didn't suffer, I can tell you that much. But I cannot tell you more." My legs gave out. I sat down heavily, my back against the cedar, my revolver hanging forgotten at my side. The creature watched me with those amber eyes, and I had the strangest sense that it was waiting, patient as the mountains themselves, for me to process what was happening. "How ... Single quotes," I started, then stopped. There were too many questions, too many impossibilities stacking up in my mind. One chose the most immediate one. "How do you know my name?" "I've watched you for 18 years, Theodore Marsh." The creature settled back on its haunches, a movement that was surprisingly graceful for something so massive. "You've walked these forests with more respect than most of your kind. You've listened when the land spoke. You've left offerings, though I don't think you realized you were doing it. Scraps of food, moments of silence in sacred places. The old ones noticed. They remember those who remember them. The old ones, my people. What's left of us." Its eyes seemed to grow distant for a moment. "We were here long before your kind crossed the land bridge from Asia. We watched you come. We watched you spread. We learned your languages as they evolved, generation after generation, because we knew that someday we would need to speak to you." "Speak to us? Why?" The creature leaned forward, and the firelight caught its face fully for the first time. I saw intelligence there, ancient and vast, but also something else, something that looked almost like fear. "Because something is coming, Theodore. Something that threatens both our kinds. And for the first time in 10,000 years, we cannot face it alone." My rational mind was screaming that this was impossible, that I was dreaming, or hallucinating, or suffering some kind of psychological break brought on by too many years of isolation. But another part of me, the part that Uncle Ray had nurtured with stories of the wild men, the part that had felt the weight of the forest's attention every time I walked beneath those ancient trees, that part knew the truth. This was real, all of it, and my life would never be the same. "The camera on your belt," the creature said, and its tone shifted to something colder, more guarded. "You should know that we cannot allow ourselves to be photographed. Not by you. Not by anyone." My hand moved instinctively to the 35mm camera hanging from my shoulder. I'd almost forgotten it was there. Why? Because proof of our existence would bring the hunters, the scientists, the government agencies that have been searching for us since your President Roosevelt first heard the stories and sent his men into these woods. We've survived for millennia by remaining hidden, by becoming legend rather than fact. The moment we become real in the eyes of your world, we become targets. I wouldn't... I wouldn't tell anyone. The creature made a sound that might have been a laugh. That's what they all say, Theodore. The ones we've trusted before. The ones who swore they would keep our secret. Its eyes met mine, and I felt the weight of centuries in that gaze. They always reach for the camera eventually. The urge to prove, to document, to share... It's hardwired into your species. You cannot help it any more than a salmon can help swimming upstream. I looked down at the camera, then back at the creature. In that moment, I understood that I was being given a choice. A test, perhaps. The kind of test that would determine whether this conversation continued or ended in ways I didn't want to imagine. Slowly, deliberately, I unclipped the camera from my shoulder. I opened the back, exposed the film to the firelight, and tossed the ruined roll into the flames. The creature watched the film curl and blacken, and when it looked at me again, something in its expression had changed. "Perhaps," it said quietly, "you are different after all." What followed was the strangest night of my life, and the beginning of an education that would consume the next 3 decades. The creature, who eventually told me I could call it by a sound that approximated Keho in English, though it admitted this was only the closest my vocal cords could come to its actual name, did not leave when dawn began to lighten the sky. Instead, it retreated to the shadows just beyond the clearing and continued to speak, its voice carrying easily through the morning mist. I learned things that night and in the nights that followed, things that rewrote everything I thought I knew about the history of this continent. Kehod's people, I was told, had once numbered in the tens of thousands. They had lived openly in the forests of North America for longer than human civilization had existed, forming complex societies with their own languages, their own culture, their own understanding of the world. They had watched the first humans cross into their territory and had debated for generations whether to make contact. The decision was made to observe, to wait, to see what kind of beings these newcomers would become. "Your ancestors were different then," Keho explained. "Smaller in number, more humble in their relationship with the land. Our elders believed you could be trusted. Some of us even made contact with your early tribes, shared knowledge, formed alliances. The native legends," I said. "The stories about Sasquatch, about forest spirits, ... based on truth. Though the truth was changed with each telling, as truths always are. We became gods to some of your tribes, demons to others. The stories served our purpose. They kept the curious away and the respectful close. But everything changed when the Europeans came." Keho described the centuries of retreat that followed, the slow withdrawal into deeper and deeper wilderness as the settlers pushed west. Its people had watched the genocide of the native tribes with horror, understanding that they would be next if they were ever discovered. They developed new strategies for remaining hidden, learned to move only at night, learned to avoid the areas where human activity was greatest. "We became ghosts," Kehoe said. "Legends. Campfire stories that your kind be told each other, but never quite believed. It was the only way to survive, but survival came at a cost. As their range contracted, so did their population. Disease killed many of them, diseases that jumped from the European settlers to the native tribes, to the forests themselves. Starvation took others, as the game they'd relied on for millennia was hunted to near extinction. And loneliness," Kehoe admitted, "took perhaps the greatest toll of all. We are social beings, Theodore. As social as your kind, perhaps more so. The isolation has broken many of us. Some have gone mad, becoming the monsters your stories describe. Others simply walked into the mountains one winter and never returned. By the 20th century, Kehoe estimated that fewer than 500 of its people remained in all of North America. They had consolidated in the last great wilderness areas, the Pacific Northwest, the Northern Rockies, the deep swamps of the Southeast. They communicated across vast distances using methods Kehoe was reluctant to describe, maintaining a loose network of family groups and solitary individuals who shared information and warnings. "We know about the expeditions," Kehoe said, "the research teams, the government programs. We've learned to recognize the patterns, to disappear before the searchers arrive, but it gets harder every year. Your technology improves faster than we can adapt. Satellites, thermal cameras, DNA analysis. The noose is tightening, Theodore. Slowly, but inevitably." I asked why Kehoe had chosen to reveal itself to me. Why, after centuries of hiding, it was willing to take such a risk. The answer chilled me more than anything else I'd heard that night. "Because we've discovered that we're not the only ones being hunted," Kehoe said. "There's a program, Theodore, hidden within your government. Hidden even from most of those who think they control such things. They've been operating in these forests for decades, and their purpose is not research. Their purpose is acquisition. Acquisition of what?" Kehoe's eyes met mine in the growing light. "Of us, of our DNA. Of whatever makes us different from your kind." It paused. Michelle Hernandez stumbled onto one of their facilities, an underground complex in the Quinault drainage, disguised as an old mining operation. She saw too much, asked too many questions, and now she's gone. I thought about the search parties, the official reports, the convenient conclusion of accidental drowning. "You're saying the government killed her?" "I'm saying that some things in your government operate beyond the reach of what you call law. They've captured several of my people over the years, taken them to places we cannot find. We don't know what happens there. We only know that none of them have ever returned." The implications of what Kehoe was telling me crashed through my mind like a cascade. If this was true, if there really was a covert program operating in my forest, then everything I'd dedicated my life to was compromised. Every report I'd filed, every survey I'd conducted, every piece of information I'd passed up the chain of command could have been feeding a machine whose true purpose I'd never suspected. "What do you want from me?" I asked. Kehoe was silent for a long moment. When it spoke again, its voice was softer, almost gentle. "We want you to be our eyes, Theodore, our ears inside your world. We want you to learn what you can about this program, to warn us when the hunters are close, to help us survive long enough to find another way. Another way to what? To live. Perhaps even to coexist someday, when your kind is ready to know the truth about us. Keiho rose, its massive form unfolding from the shadows, with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large. I've told you more tonight than we've told any human in 500 years. You can choose to believe me or not. You can choose to help us or not. But know this, Theodore Marsh. If you betray what I've told you, if you try to document us or lead others to us, we will know, and we will act accordingly. It wasn't a threat. Not exactly. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered with the calm certainty of a being that had watched civilizations rise and fall. I won't betray you, I said, but I need to know more. I need to understand what I'm dealing with before I can help. Keiho nodded, a surprisingly human gesture. Then we will speak again. There's a place, 3 days' walk from here, where my people sometimes gather. I will leave markers for you. Follow them when the moon is dark, and come alone. Bring no cameras, no recording devices. Only your mind and your willingness to learn. And with that, Keiho turned and walked into the forest. Within seconds, it had vanished completely, swallowed by the shadows between the ancient trees as if it had never existed at all. I stood in that clearing for a long time, watching the sun rise over the Olympics, feeling the weight of everything I'd learnt pressing down on my shoulders. My life, I understood, had just been divided into 2 parts, everything before this night and everything after. 3 weeks later, I followed the markers. They were subtle, nearly invisible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. A particular arrangement of stones at the base of a tree, a branch bent at an angle that didn't match the natural fall of the forest, scratches on bark that could have been made by any animal but weren't. Keiho had been right. I'd been walking these forests for 18 years and had probably passed 100 such markers without ever registering their existence. The journey took me deep into territory I'd only visited a handful of times, areas that were officially classified as wilderness study areas, closed to all but essential personnel. I told the ranger station I was conducting a routine survey of the upper Elwha drainage. I told myself I wasn't lying, exactly, just omitting certain details that they wouldn't believe anyway. On the 3rd night, as a new moon turned the forest into a labyrinth of shadows, I found the gathering place. It was a natural amphitheater, a bowl-shaped depression surrounded by some of the oldest trees I'd ever seen. Sitka spruce that must have been seedlings when Columbus was still a child. Western red cedars with trunks so massive that 10 men couldn't have circled them with outstretched arms. And in the center of that bowl, gathered around a fire that burned with no visible fuel, were 17 of Keiho's people. I froze at the edge of the clearing, suddenly certain that I'd made a terrible mistake. 17 pairs of amber eyes turned toward me, reflecting the strange light of that impossible fire, and I felt the full weight of their attention like a physical force pressing against my chest. Then Keiho stepped forward and the pressure eased. "Theodore Marsh," it said, and there was something almost like pride in its voice. "You came." The gathering that followed lasted 3 days. I learned that Keiho's people had no single name for themselves, just as they had no single language. Each regional group had developed its own dialects over the millennia, though they could all communicate through a combination of vocalizations, gestures, and something Keiho described as the old way, a method of sharing thoughts and images that I never fully understood but occasionally felt at the edges of my perception. I learned that they were not apes, despite their superficial resemblance to the great apes of Africa and Asia. Their DNA, Kehoe explained, would show significant overlap with human DNA if anyone ever managed to sequence it, but there were differences, fundamental differences. They aged more slowly than humans. They could see in spectrums of light that human eyes couldn't detect. They could hear frequencies that human ears couldn't process. And they could, under certain circumstances, influence the perceptions of other beings in ways that might be called telepathy, if you wanted to use a word that Kehoe considered imprecise. We are what your scientists might call a parallel branch, Kehoe said. Your kind and ours shared an ancestor long before either of us looked the way we look now. But we evolved differently, adapted to different environments, developed different capabilities. Why didn't you develop technology? I asked. Tools, writing, civilization? Kehoe made that sound again, the one that might have been a laugh. Who says we didn't? Your kind assumes that civilization means cities and machines and the domination of nature. We chose a different path. We learned to live within the systems that existed rather than building new ones on top of them. Our knowledge is stored in memory rather than in books. Our tools are our hands and our minds. Our civilization is invisible to your kind, precisely because it doesn't look like anything you would recognize a civilization. On the second night, I met an elder named Chukar, one of the oldest of Kehoe's people still alive. Chukar's hair had turned silver with age, and its movements were slower than the others. But its eyes held a depth of experience that made Kehoe seem young by comparison. Chukar had been alive when Lewis and Clark first crossed the Rockies. It had watched from the shadows as the cause of discovery passed within 100 yards of its family group, too focused on their mission to notice the enormous shapes observing them from the tree line. It had witnessed the coming of the railroads, the logging operations, the slow transformation of wilderness into something else. And it had memories of the facilities. They took my daughter, Chukar said, its voice barely above a whisper. In the winter of your year 1958. We searched for 3 seasons before we found the place where they had taken her. An underground complex, hidden beneath the mountains, guarded by men with weapons we didn't understand. We couldn't get close. We could only watch and wait and hope. What happened to her? Chukar was silent for a long moment. We don't know. We never saw her again. But sometimes, in the deep night, some of us have felt ... something. A presence that might be her. A call that might be coming from that place or somewhere like it. Fragmented, changed, no longer entirely herself. The implications of what Chukar was describing made me feel physically ill. These facilities, I said. Where are they? How many are they? We know of 3, Kehoe answered. The one in the Quinault drainage, where Michelle Hernandez was taken. Another somewhere in the mountains of Montana. And a third in a place we cannot reach, somewhere in the far north, beyond the territories we can safely travel. And the government knows about all of this? About your people? Some parts of your government know, others do not. We have observed that your system of power is complex, with many factions competing for control of information and resources. The faction that operates these facilities seems to exist outside normal oversight. They have resources that other agencies do not. They operate with impunity. I thought about everything I knew about the Forest Service, about the Department of the Interior, about the Byzantine networks of federal agencies that supposedly manage the public lands. I thought about the reports I'd filed over the years, The strange incidents I'd noted, the questions I'd asked that had never been satisfactorily answered. And I thought about what it would mean to go up against something like that. If you've stayed with me this long, if you're feeling that chill running down your spine right now, I need you to subscribe to this channel. Because what I'm about to tell you is the part of the story that almost got me killed. And I need to know that someone out there is listening, really listening, before I go on. Tell me in the comments, do you think Bigfoot is a monster to be feared, or something else entirely? Something we should have been protecting all along? I returned from that, gathering a changed man. On the surface, nothing was different. I continued my patrols, filed my reports, attended the quarterly meetings at the regional office. But underneath, I'd become something else. A spy. A double agent in a war that most people didn't know existed. Over the next 2 years, I gathered information. I learned to notice things I'd always overlooked before. The helicopters that flew patterns inconsistent with search and rescue operations. The supply trucks that drove into the backcountry on roads that weren't supposed to exist. The men in unmarked uniforms who occasionally appeared at ranger stations, asking questions about unusual sightings that my colleagues invariably reported as false alarms. I cultivated relationships with anyone who might know something. Old-timers who'd worked in the forest since before I was born. Native elders who trusted me enough to share fragments of oral history. Even a few contacts at the regional office who seemed to harbor their own suspicions about what was happening in the deep wilderness. And slowly, piece by piece, I assembled a picture of what I was up against. The program had no official name, at least none that appeared in any document I could access. But its footprint was everywhere once you knew what to look for. Funding that disappeared into black budget line items. Research projects that started with fanfare and then vanished without explanation. Personnel who transferred in from agencies that didn't seem to exist and transferred out to destinations that couldn't be verified. The Quinault facility, I learned, had been operating since the late 1940s. It had originally been constructed as part of a network of Cold War installations, supposedly designed to monitor Soviet submarine activity in the Pacific. But the records I managed to access told a different story. The facility had been expanded multiple times over the decades, growing deeper into the mountain with each renovation. Its current configuration included laboratories, holding areas, and something described only as the observation chamber. I knew I had to see it for myself. The opportunity came in the spring of 1994. A series of unusual weather patterns had created flooding throughout the Western Olympics, and I was assigned to survey the damage in the Quinault watershed. It was the perfect cover. I could justify being in the area for days without raising suspicion. On my third day in the drainage, I found it. The entrance was hidden behind a waterfall, exactly where Kehoe had said it would be. From the outside, it looked like nothing more than a crack in the basalt cliff face, invisible, unless you knew exactly where to look. I waited until nightfall, then made my approach. What I found inside defied everything I thought I understood about my government. The tunnel behind the waterfall extended for nearly half a mile into the mountain, lit by fixtures that hummed with a frequency just below the threshold of hearing. The walls were lined with cables and conduits, carrying power and data deeper into the complex, and at regular intervals there were doors, heavy steel doors with electronic locks and small windows that revealed rooms full of equipment I couldn't identify. I moved as quietly as I could, staying in the shadows. using every skill I'd developed in 2 decades of backcountry work to avoid detection. The facility seemed understaffed, perhaps due to the flooding that had cut off road access, and I was able to penetrate deeper than I'd expected. And then I found the holding area. I still see it in my nightmares. Rows of cells carved into the living rock, each one containing a figure that I recognized immediately. Kehof's people. A dozen of them, perhaps more. Some were lying motionless on metal platforms that might have been beds or might have been operating tables. Others were pacing their enclosures with a kind of frantic energy that spoke of minds pushed past their breaking point. And in the cell at the very end, I saw a figure with silver hair and eyes that held the weight of centuries. Chukar's daughter. She was alive, changed, as Chukar had feared, with sensors attached to her skull and wires trailing from her body to machines that blinked and hummed in the darkness. But alive. Our eyes met through the reinforced glass of her cell, and I felt something pass between us. Recognition, hope, and underneath it all, a desperate plea for help. I don't know how long I stood there. Seconds, minutes. Time had lost all meaning in that place. But eventually, I heard footsteps approaching from somewhere deeper in the facility, and I knew I had to move. I retreated through the tunnels, moving faster now, caution replaced by a desperate need to escape before I was discovered. The entrance was just ahead, the sound of the waterfall masking my footsteps when I heard the voice behind me. "That's far enough, Ranger Marsh." I turned. 2 men stood in the tunnel, dressed in black uniforms with no insignia. One of them held a weapon I didn't recognize. Something looked like a rifle, but wasn't quite right. The other held a flashlight that pinned me in its beam like an insect on a display board. "We've been expecting you," the man with the flashlight said. "Your friends in the forest aren't as subtle as they think they are. And neither are you." This was it, I thought. The end of everything. I'd walked into a trap, and now I would join Chukar's daughter in one of those cells. Another specimen for whatever experiments they were conducting in this underground nightmare. But I'd forgotten something important. I hadn't come alone. The attack came so fast that I barely registered it. One moment, the 2 men were standing in front of me, weapons raised. The next, something massive and dark had emerged from the shadows behind them, moving with a speed that defied its size. I heard sounds that I won't describe, sounds that I have spent 30 years trying to forget. And then I was being lifted, carried through the waterfall and into the night beyond, the cold water washing over me like a baptism. Keho didn't speak as we fled through the forest. It moved with a purpose that didn't allow for conversation, covering distances that would have taken me hours in what felt like minutes. When it finally set me down, we were miles from the facility, in a part of the forest I didn't recognize. "You shouldn't have gone in there," Keho said. Its voice was different than before, harder. "You could have been killed. You could have compromised everything. I saw them," I gasped. "Your people, Chukar's daughter. They're alive, Keho. Some of them are still alive." Keho was silent for a long moment. When it spoke again, its voice had changed once more, the hardness giving way to something that sounded almost like grief. "We know, we've always known, but we cannot reach them. The defenses are too strong, the technology too advanced. We have tried, Theodore. For decades, we have tried. There has to be a way. Perhaps, but not tonight. Tonight, we survive. Tonight, we plan. And tomorrow, ... Single quotes. Kehof's amber eyes met mine in the darkness. Tomorrow, we find another path. The years that followed were the hardest of my life. I couldn't report what I'd seen. Couldn't tell anyone about the facility, the prisoners, the impossible truth I'd witnessed beneath the mountains. The men in black uniforms had known my name, which meant that someone in my chain of command was connected to the program. Any report I filed would go directly to the people running it, so I stayed silent. I kept my head down. I continued my patrols and filed my reports and pretended that nothing had changed, even as the knowledge of what I'd seen burned inside me like an infection that wouldn't heal. Keiho and I continued to meet, though less frequently than before. The incident at the facility had heightened the program's awareness, and Keiho's people had retreated deeper into the wilderness, moving constantly to avoid detection. Our conversations became briefer, more cautious, conducted in whispers at the edges of clearings where neither of us felt entirely safe. I learned that the two men I'd encountered had disappeared. Their bodies were never found, and their existence was erased from whatever records the program maintained. Keiho never spoke about what had happened to them, and I never asked. But the prisoners remained in their cells, and Jorkar's daughter remained connected to the machines that I saw every time I closed my eyes. In 1997, I was offered early retirement. The official reason was budget cuts, part of a broader reduction in Forest Service staffing that affected hundreds of rangers across the Pacific Northwest. But I knew the real reason. Someone, somewhere, had decided that I was a liability, a loose end that needed to be quietly removed from the equation. I took the offer. What choice did I have? The years that followed blurred together in a haze of isolation and obsession. I moved to a small cabin near the edge of the Olympic National Forest, close enough that I could still walk in the woods I'd spent my life protecting, far enough that I could maintain the fiction of normal retirement. I stopped talking to almost everyone I'd known, my colleagues, my remaining family. Even Sarah, who'd remarried by then and had built a life that didn't have room for the broken man I'd become. But I never stopped watching, never stopped gathering information, never stopped looking for the other path that Keiho had promised we would find. And then, in the summer of 2019, something changed. I was walking a familiar trail near my cabin when I felt it, the same preternatural silence that had preceded my first encounter with Keiho, almost 30 years before. I stopped, my heart hammering in my chest, and waited. Keiho emerged from the forest, looking older than I remembered. Its hair had begun to silver, like Chukar's, and its movements were slower, more deliberate. But its eyes still held that same ancient intelligence, and when it spoke, its voice was clear as ever. "It's time, Theodore." Time for what? To tell the story. All of it. To anyone who will listen. I didn't understand at first. For 3 decades, Keiho's people had demanded secrecy above all else. They had killed to protect that secrecy, had sacrificed their own freedom to maintain the illusion that they didn't exist. "The world has changed," Keiho explained. "Your kind has developed tools that make hiding impossible. Satellites that can see through forest canopy. Algorithms that can analyze patterns in data we don't even know we're leaving behind. The program has grown stronger, more sophisticated. They're close, Theodore. Closer than they've ever been to capturing enough of us to achieve whatever they've been working toward all these years. What do you want me to do? Speak. Tell your story. Let the world know that we exist, that we've existed alongside you for millennia, that we're not the monsters your legends have made us out to be. Perhaps, if enough people know the truth, the program will be forced into the light. Perhaps, for the first time in history, we can face this enemy together." I looked at Keiho. at this being who had changed my life in ways I still couldn't fully comprehend, and I understood what it was asking. It was asking me to become the proof it had always forbidden, not through cameras or DNA samples or any of the physical evidence that the hunters had always sought, through something more powerful. My voice, my story, my witness. And if they come for me, I asked, if the program decides I'm too dangerous to let keep talking. Keiho's expression shifted, and I saw something there that I'd never seen before. Something that looked almost human. Then we will be watching, Theodore, as we've always been watching. And this time, we will not let them take you. So here I am, 73 years old, sitting in a cabin at the edge of the wilderness I've loved my entire life, speaking into a camera that Keiho's people will never see but have given me permission to use. I've told you everything, every secret I've carried for 33 years, every impossible truth that I witnessed in the forests of the Olympic Peninsula, every moment of wonder and terror and heartbreak that has shaped the man I've become. I don't expect you to believe me. I've had 3 decades to come to terms with how this story sounds, with how easily it can be dismissed as the ramblings of a lonely old man who spent too much time in the woods. I understand the skepticism. In some ways, I welcome it. Skepticism is healthy. Skepticism is how we separate truth from fiction in a world full of people willing to lie for attention or profit. But I also know what I saw, what I heard, what I've carried with me every day since that September night in 1991 when a voice in the darkness spoke my name. Keiho's people are real. They've lived alongside us for longer than human civilization has existed. They've watched us grow from scattered tribes of hunter-gatherers into the global force we've become. They've retreated before us, adapted around us, hidden from us, all while maintaining a culture and a wisdom that we can barely imagine. And right now, in facilities hidden beneath the mountains I've dedicated my life to protecting, some of them are being held captive, studied, experimented upon, treated as specimens rather than as the intelligent, sentient beings they are. I don't know what the program is trying to achieve. I don't know what they hope to learn from the bodies and minds of Keiho's people, but I know that it's wrong. Wrong in a way that transcends politics or policy, or any of the justifications that powerful people use to excuse the inexcusable. I'm telling this story because I believe that secrets, even necessary secrets, have a weight that eventually becomes unbearable. I'm telling it because Keiho asked me to, and I've learned to trust Keiho's judgment in ways that I've never trusted any humans. And I'm telling it because I'm 73 years old, and I don't know how many more chances I'll have to say what needs to be said. Maybe nothing will come of this. Maybe this video will disappear into the vast ocean of content that floods the internet every day. One more voice lost in the noise. Maybe the program will see it and laugh, confident in their ability to discredit anyone who threatens their secrecy. Or maybe, just maybe, someone will listen. Someone with the power to ask questions. Someone with the courage to demand answers. Someone who looks at the wilderness with different eyes from now on and wonders what else might be watching from the shadows. To that person, wherever you are, I have one final message from Keiho, and from the elders who have agreed to let me speak on their behalf. We're here. We've always been here. And we're not your enemy. The forests are older than any of us. They hold secrets that we're only beginning to understand. And in those forests, there are beings who have been waiting for millennia for humanity to grow up enough to become partners rather than threats. I've spent my whole life in the woods. I've seen things that most people will never see, felt connections that most people will never feel, learned truths that most people will never accept. And if there's one thing I know with absolute certainty, it's this: the world is bigger than we think it is. Stranger, more wonderful, more terrifying. And the line between legend and reality is thinner than we've ever imagined. If this story has made you look at the forest differently, if it's made you wonder what else might be out there, waiting to be discovered, then subscribe to this channel right now. There are more stories coming, more truths that need to be told. Click on one of the videos appearing on your screen, because each one holds a secret as disturbing as this one. Thank you for listening. Thank you for believing, or at least for keeping an open mind. And remember, the next time you're walking in the deep woods and the forest goes suddenly, inexplicably silent, pay attention.